This is Gibson's first attempt at the banjo. Now, if you're aware of Gibson's history, they tend to be behind the commercial curve all the time. I mean, they were holding fast to the mandolin while the banjo was taking off. Then they were holding fast to the banjo while the guitar was taking off. They generally caught up with a vengeance. That was the good thing about it. But this first banjo, it's simply a TB. This was 1918. You can see it is a 15-fret neck, beholding to the transition of people from the mandolin to the banjo. Tuned in fifths, of course. Tenor banjo allowed mandolin players to make a quick transition to the tenor banjo. And the shorter fingerboard, tenor banjo scale had not been standardized yet at that point in time. But it didn't make it quite the stretch that a 23-inch tenor banjo would have made. The look on this thing, again, very reminiscent of what their mandolins at that time would have looked like. This, very reddish orange hue in the sunburst, and really nicely finished. You'll notice as we get into Gibson's production banjos a little bit later, this just gradual decline in this attention to the fine detail of finishing. They made some great sounding banjos and such, but this attention to strict, beautiful detail was gone or going away. This is what we call a trapdoor. Many of you have seen them before. It was an innovation which allowed, by connecting this little gadget to the coordinator rod in there, it allowed not only a better ergonomic playing position, it pushed the banjo out to a very good spot where it should be, it also allowed some of the sound out of the chamber here, while this oval hold, almost like you'd see on a pre-F-hole mandolin, but an F4 mandolin or lower grade F mandolin, allowed some of the sound out when the trapdoor was closed. This was pretty ingenious to allow the player to hear some of the sound. So it's a very functional instrument. They still work, and this was, as you can see, a predecessor to the later flanges that were supported by this tube that goes around, and there's a little protrusion from the wooden rim that holds this tube from pulling up, and that allows the easy access to the hardware to adjust head tension. Fairly simple banjo, but still kind of elegant and in this fineness of the detail of finishing. So that's where they started. I'll give you one more example of Gibson's hanging on to mandolin technology and fineness of finish. As the banjo craze hit, this is basically 1922 we're looking at here. A mandolin banjo seemed like a good idea. Physically, there's a lot of downward pressure on the bridge created by these 8 very, very tense strings. So the physics don't play out too well. If the strings are low enough that you can actually fret them, they buzz and rattle. And if you get them up high enough where they don't buzz and rattle, you can't press them down. They're very difficult. But all that said, this is a virtual time capsule example of an early Gibson banjo mandolin. This nice kind of variation of what we call the snakehead peghead with little cutouts and little variegation of the curve there. Very elegant. The finish and the metal parts, as you can see, are perfect. This is basically. We wish we could get really desirable banjos in this condition. I mean, we love the fact that it survived literally 100 years at this point, in almost brand new condition, broken string and all. But again, you can see the attention to the beautiful variegation on the shading, and it's still, to someone who likes old instruments, it's very exciting to see.
Are those necks and rod laminated?
Well,
Is this a lamination? Or
yeah, that's a lamination. This is not the same part of this
Right.
body. The dowel stick is glued in.
Right.
But yeah, that appears to be a laminated dowel stick, which I've never actually noticed before.
And this signature is?
That's the manufacturer of the head,
okay.
Joseph Rogers. And that's, again, one of those telltale things that tells you the banjo hasn't been messed with when you find the original head on it. Yeah.
Is that
And-
skin?
Yes.
Oh, of
Yeah.
course.
Calf skin. Yeah. Yeah. And
Johnny, these are hand rubbed finishes?
what's that? Yeah. Yeah. You bet. This is what made me buy this banjo. I said, when I looked at the case, I said, if the case is that good after 100 years, what's inside of it's got to be pretty good too. I mean, you can interpret photos a lot, and you look at it and say, boy, it really looks great. And this one particularly did not disappoint once it arrived. The next generation of Gibson banjos, these were done during the tenure of Lloyd Loar, who was Gibson's acoustic R&D person, a great acoustic engineer, wonderful mandolinist. But he had some really wonderful, innovative ideas about banjos. This is, and by the way, I'll cut to the chase. This is Lloyd Loar's personal banjo.
Wow.
The story about it, prior to the construction aspect of it, was after he left Gibson, he worked on experiments with amplifying instruments, the Vivatone company, and working with other manufacturers. And he got sick in the early 1940s, and he packed up all of his instruments, some, how should I say, manufactured like the Gibson things, and some experimental things. And they all were in storage from basically 1942 until 1988. And his wife paid for storage all that time, not really knowing what was in there. And there is a music historian and instrument specialist named Roger Siminoff, who became close with Loar's wife, and she allowed him to go in and unpack and find all this stuff. And this banjo was in that lot. So when we found out about it and Roger was willing to part with it, we had a museum, a couple benefactors, June and Charles Johnson, who gave us the money that was necessary to acquire this, because it's really quite historic, not only a transitional piece for Gibson to illustrate Gibson's manufacturing evolution, but a piece of history with the Loar connection. So, Loar's innovations, I can't show you inside here, but if you're banjo people, you've heard the term ball-bearing tone ring. The tone ring that is inside of this banjo is essentially the ball-bearing tone ring that came out in the next generation, further developed, of Gibson Mastertones. This is basically the same tone ring without the springs underneath. It's just floating on here. But Loar's innovation, primarily because of his acoustic science expertise, was this, I can't call it parabolic, but it's a resonator that is concave inside here, grabbing the vibrations from the center of the banjo head and then regenerating them out towards the listener. Up to this point, all banjo resonators, with the exception of Paramount, were flat, and usually they were just an add-on accessory. They didn't necessarily, resonators were just coming in their own. But this is a very acoustically well thought out design. But it's made of celluloid, and also prone to breaking and not necessarily creating much tone, but it's creating more volume. But this celluloid material on here, we call it pearloid. It's a celluloid with little sheets of iridescent pearl-like material and colors going through there. And this one is very prominent with the pinks and the greens, and it was really exotic material when it was first introduced. It became later very, very common. You see it on, light plates, switch covers and toilet seats. Guys call this mother of toilet seat, which is, the worst slang for this particular coloration. They called it clown barf. And that you'll find that mentioned many times in collectors' parlance and such. But the again, beautiful maple on the neck. This, I guess I should point out the peg head shapes as they evolve as well. This is about the only period you'll see what we call the moccasin peg head shape.
What's the word?
Moccasin. And by this time we had evolved to a 17 fret neck. So we were getting closer to the the standard of a 19 fret neck. A 10.5 inch head wasn't quite up to where the 11 laid out later on as the standard. Condition-wise, this again is wonderful. The gold plating on this is original and pristine. It's beautiful. It's just the way we'd love to see gold look, without that shininess and everything. And just again, little attention to detail like they would have on the mandolins. The Gibson engraved on the edge of this cloverleaf tailpiece. All in all, just a wonderful little piece of history and Gibson evolution.
Is the pot the same material as this?
No, the pot is wood, but it is shelled in.
Okay.
It's got a veneer up here of the pearloid, and then down here. But if you look up here, you can see the little protrusion holding the tube.
Yeah.
Is the natural wood.
I see.
Yeah.
And then these little spacers are,
Yeah, they're glued to the back.
they go all the way across?
Only about
To the center?
yeah, to the center. I don't want to pop it off.
Oh, no, I'm not asking.
Only I would, but these are so fragile and they break.
Sure.
And I've had it off, and we have photos I can show you of the inside of it. But it's they go to, you can see
Oh, yeah, sure.
to about there. It isn't completely opaque. There's one of the fins and such, so you can see through it a little bit. And against the light here, it's even
Oh, okay, yeah. There you go.
more. The next generation of the Mastertone came out in 1925. It is what we'll call the modern. It looks like a modern Mastertone banjo. This doesn't look like a banjo you'd get excited about if you saw it on eBay. This is one you would, or hear forward. At this point in time, the tone ring system became standard for this part of time. It was a floating ball bearing tone ring. Down into the wooden shell of this banjo, they had drilled holes and they put springs in there. On top of the springs, they put ball bearings, and on top of the ball bearings rested this little tone ring. Okay. That the idea of the ball bearing tone ring was that as temperature and humidity changed, the springs would expand and contract and allow the head to expand and contract without the necessity of taking the resonator off and adjusting manually the head tension. It kind of worked, but not really. You got to a point, especially if you put a lot of pressure, and of course this would have been a skinhead at the time as well.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. So it's still a skinhead at that time. They
Yes.
didn't have
Plastic, yeah, didn't have plastic.
Plastic.
So that your only option was a skinhead, and you were constantly adjusting
Right.
for these changes in temperature and humidity, and trying to circumvent that. This floating ball bearing tone ring system came out, and as I say, if you had a low pressure on your head, it worked better. But if you really cranked it down, you just compressed the springs down as far as they would go, and they didn't really have much enough oomph to come back. So, but that tone ring lasted only a couple of years before they realized not only was it labor intensive and not working, they could create something easier, and we'll get to that tone ring later. But for a couple of years, they had this floating ball bearing tone ring. The very earliest ones had holes in the side, drilled through the side. Back to that trap door one, the idea was to allow some sound to escape from the side and allow the player to be able to hear it. How effective it was, I don't know. We'll have to say probably not too effective, because by 1926, the holes were gone. Again, more labor intensive, anything they can do to make it less expensive to produce. As banjos became more popular and more in demand, Gibson started to realize, hey, the fineness and the time we spend on some of this detail has to get reduced. Same for the peg head here. Most Mastertone banjos that you'll see after 1926 will have a little block in the fingerboard that says Mastertone. It's engraved Mastertone. In the 1925, 1926 series, they took little pieces of pearl spelling out Mastertone. Each one of them had to be cut out, inlaid, and filled. I mean, it was really a labor-intensive thing. This particular model was the top of the line. It's called a Granada, and when you hear of Earl Scruggs Granada, this was the first of an ever-evolving line of Granada banjos. They are distinctive because they're not overstated as far as their decoration. Beautiful woods, again, some these concentric marquetry rings that carry to the binding on the side, as well as the binding on the neck. It's very understated, very elegant, and this nice little marquetry inlay, which was not typical of a Granada. The Style 5 was the one that had that marquetry on the back of the peg head, but for a brief period, obviously, they were including it on the Granada model. Granada was a gold-plated banjo. It was engraved with these little semicircular arcs on the tension hoop, and also, this is only for real Gibson diehard people. The flange plate is also engraved, but this engraving on here is very unusual. I've never seen it on any other Granada. It's just a very simple engraving pattern, kind of mimicking these semicircles on the tension hoop. Tension hoop at this point we call it a grooved tension hoop, and the hooks that connect were flat to go into the groove. So it all fits together really, really nicely, but again, a lot more labor intensive than the banjos that were to follow. So this inlay pattern we call hearts and flowers, very, just how do I want to say it? It's iconic Gibson design, the most copied inlay pattern of any of the Gibson banjos ever made. And notice the peg head shape here, changing from that moccasin. This is what we call the fiddle-shaped peg head. It stayed with Gibson for quite a while, until the 30s, and in this case, these little F-hole inlays kind of mimic where an F-hole might be on a violin body. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of thought that went into every little detail on the design of this banjo. This particular one has been refinished. I point this out. I don't like to give any wrong impressions. This one did not survive this well since 1926. It's been refinished and replated. The plating is quite old, but the way we know for certain that it's been replated, typically on the tension hoop, the underside of this little arc would be shiny, and the top of it would be matte. Yeah, yeah. So you know pretty much for sure when you see that happen. There are ways to obviously, get that to look like it did before, but in this case, those steps weren't taken. So this has been redone. This was donated to us by one of our benefactors and how should I say, ambassadors named Phil Cartwright. So that was a very nice gift from Phil. The top, in terms of its decorative aspect, why it's the next generation of Gibson Mastertone is this incorporates the cast tone ring. The ball bearing tone ring is now gone. It replaced by a one-piece cast and machined tone ring. Looks very similar. It has this little, what we call archtop, this secondary raised area and the bevel around the outside. But again, not to be confused. This is the ball bearing tone ring. Many parts, dozens and dozens of parts. You take the head off, everything falls all over the place, and it's a nightmare. So these were easier to produce, cheaper to produce, and in a general sense, they're one of the two most desirable Gibson tone rings in hindsight. They stumbled upon a good combination of things that creates this wonderful, cutting, bright sound. The fact that you have this raised area between the bevel, between arch bevel, whatever you want to call it, this area creates a smaller vibrating surface than would exist if there wasn't that bevel. So these tend to be brighter and sharper in tone, and some bluegrass players, the Dr. Ralph Stanley people, like that. The Doug Dillard people like the sound of the archtop tone ring. The prevailing thought is that you have to have the flathead tone ring, which we'll get into a little bit later, but many, like I say, many bluegrass players prefer the cutting sound of the archtop tone ring. I will point out tenor banjo players too. They also like it. And if you get a really good, well set up archtop Gibson 40-hole archtop, they sound wonderful. We just put one together the other day, and holy cow, it just jumped out, as being exceptionally good sounding. Now, let's get to the after the construction features. And by the way, I'll point out this flange configuration carries over from the earliest TB, having that plate or that tube resting on a protrusion from the rim so that you can adjust head tension. By this time, we had added this plate. I should have mentioned that. By the 1925 series, behind that little tube came this plate. We call it a two-piece flange or tube and plate flange. That'll only make sense when we get to the fact that they eliminated it later. But these are two separate pieces, and the plate allows the support of the resonator that by this time had come out basically almost an inch from the body, and the plate with its sound holes allows the sound to go straight out towards the listener. So in 1927, Gibson had banjos ranging from their least expensive, which was the TB3, basic mahogany wood and minimal inlays. It was a professional grade instrument though. All the sound parts that we've just talked about in construction elements were there, but it was very simple in decoration. By this time, the banjo was starting to take off as a mainstream pop instrument, and players were trying to strut their stuff with showing off with more and more decoration. So you had the TB3, which was simple, the TB4, which was a little more elaborate, but still a fairly simple banjo. They had the TB5. Well, actually in 27, the TB5 was replaced by the TB6, which I'll show you an example of. That was more involved. This is a 6 with a gold plating, this checkerboard engraving, that sort of stuff. It was that's a favorite, but let's start with this one here. This is the high point, I guess. They're custom-made banjos. Gibson in 1927 introduced two models. that were called custom banjos. The Bella Voce was one. It sold for $350, and the Florentine was the other, sold for $450. While there were many, many examples of these Bella Voces and Florentines made, they gave you a choice of 4 different wood finishes. You could have what they called white holly, which is this yellowish looking finish right here. It's actually maple that's painted yellow. It's not white holly wood. Then you had natural maple. This is a natural maple one. You had the option of walnut, natural walnut, and Brazilian rosewood. And then on top of that, the white part around here is called binding. Behind that we have a decorative thing called purfling. You had the
What's the word?
purfling, and you had the choice of 5 different purfling options. So I'm not a mathematician, but you had the choice of 4 woods and 5 purfling options that allowed you to come up with something that was for you, you know, fit your taste as far as a visual dynamic. The Florentine was supposedly based on Florence, Italy. The coat of arms on the back is the coat of arms of Florence, Italy. On the fingerboard, however, there are little pictures which would imply scenes of Florence, Italy, but they're not. These are all scenes of Venice. So and anybody that knows much about Italian architecture and such, they can tell you which church that is, which bridge that is. It's all scenes of Venice. So it should be a Venetian Florentine or something like that, but it didn't matter. For marketing purposes, it was called a Florentine. This particular one, as an example, is as perfect a banjo as exists in our museum. This is completely original, not touched, not played. The telltale sign on these is the armrest. Typically, the armrest would have wear on it,
Right.
even after a couple of days of playing. This one was virtually never played.
Wow.
It is, and as far as I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of them, this is the best Florentine in existence.
Where was that found?
This came from Steve Martin.
Oh,
This was from
okay.
from his collection, and he bought it with the intention. He has 2 Florentines already.
His 5 strings of his
Yes.
original 5 string was a Florentine.
Right, right.
Okay.
And he has two Florentines. There, he bought one, and they're both Archtops. He bought one and then was afraid that it was going to get stolen when he was on the road, so he bought another one.
As you would.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that's just, yeah. That's the same reaction I had. Yeah. But so he bought another one, and then he doesn't collect banjos, but he has a gathering of historic banjos, significant banjos, and modern banjos. And when he bought this one, it was with the intention of it being converted to a 5-string. And because of the artistic collector in him, he saw the condition of it and just couldn't do it. So he allowed it to, get out of his collection. Let's put it that way. So that's where that came from.
Johnny, you were talking about the different resonator woods and so forth. Is there a tone preference to the type of wood of a tenor player, 5-string player, plectrum player?
Well, the guys will swear there is. I don't get it. I mean, I don't hear it. And
It's not significant if it.
well, I think it's in people's mind that because Ralph Stanley's resonator was walnut, I have to have a walnut resonator,
Yeah.
and such, and that association with players of prominence or players of favor really influences the choices of other players. Yes, I can tell you, the harder the wood, typically there will be, and in the case of banjos, it carries through from not only the resonator but to the shell and the neck.
Right.
So if the neck and resonator and shell are made of harder, denser woods, you will typically have a little bit brighter tone and more sustain. This is most notably It doesn't happen in Gibson banjos, but in the Bacon banjos, the B&D banjos, when they use ebony on the neck, that really tends to create this great amount of sustain that doesn't exist typically on a banjo, and more volume, more cutting power, and more mass. The more mass you can, in a general sense, you can add to a banjo, it typically allows you to push it a little harder physically, but playing it without it breaking up and becoming distorted. That sort of thing. Show how, first off, I wanted to have a TB6 that was presentable in the exhibit, but I also wanted to show how you shouldn't try to refinish a banjo. It's very pretty, don't get me wrong. It's a very, very pretty job, but the coloring is not right. They went a little, in the catalog, they called the sunburst finish here Argentine gray, and whoever did the refinishing went a little overboard on the gray. You know, and it's normally a lot more orange with hints of gray, and this was done by somebody who didn't have an example to work with. Nice work, don't get me wrong, it's pretty, but the coloring is wrong. Then we get into the metal parts here, which have been obviously re-gold plated. The plating on this had a high content of copper in it.
More of a rose gold.
Yeah, which ends up looking like this. It's not quite rose gold, but there's a lot more copper. The plater probably told the person that had this work done that it was going to be 24 karat gold plated, and that's why it looks different. That's not true. This is they don't do that. This is just a higher copper content, which gives this orangish look to it. Then the biggest sin of all in replating these banjos is when you prepare them by over buffing the parts, so that this little X pattern here on this tension hoop, which should be very, very clear and crisp as you look at the crisp engraving on these other banjos, it's all almost obliterated. It's there, but only a shadow of its former self. So it's from a perspective of looking at it, sure, it's a pretty banjo, and it's got all the right parts, all its guts are there, but it's not the way you should restore a banjo. But I again purposely put this here so that we can talk about the ones around it, and by contrast show how good they are. You know, and it's very distinctive because of that. Also because it carries through onto the fingerboard. Rarely do you see that on the fingerboard. The pattern on the peg head, again, not overstated, but it really jumps out. They made a variation of this banjo that had the same gold sparkle purfling, and there's one of those downstairs in the bluegrass area. That is, I love the sparkle binding on the 6. I think it's really, really prettier than the it kind of overstated checkerboard binding, but everybody that's a TB6 guy argument that will never be solved. Here in the Gibson Ledger is listed as a Granada, and there is almost nothing Granada about this banjo. This is I included it to make sure that people understood that while Gibson offered 4 woods and 5 purfling choices on the Florentine, they would make anything you wanted if you asked them, and paid them to do it. This banjo was made for a guy named Russ Miller in 1928. He apparently was a supplier for Gibson, maybe in their cafeteria or something like this, and he wanted them to make him a special banjo, so they made him this tenor banjo in 1928. It's called a Granada. The only thing Granada about it are the 2 circles on the back, and it's made of maple. I can't say that, but the finish is this amber blonde finish that really didn't exist on any stock Gibson banjo. outside of the maple Florentine. So it's tinted like a maple Florentine with that kind of amber thing. It has one of those 5 purfling choices that were offered on the Florentine on the side of the resonator and the side of the neck. The metal parts are engraved as a Florentine. So it is the same tension hoop, tone ring, and flange plate, and armrest and tailpiece that are on a Florentine. You have the hearts and flowers inlay pattern again, as we talked about. Then you have this. This is the weirdest thing about it is this peghead overlay, very similar pearloid material to what you saw on a Florentine, but no rhinestones. And rather than the name Gibson inlaid in rhinestones on the Florentine, they put it in black celluloid, inlaid in black celluloid on there. So it's a very neat banjo, and we have all the paperwork that goes with it. So we know, when it was ordered, why it was ordered, and it's in really, really good shape. I mentioned about the armrest being your telltale sign. This wasn't played a lot, but it was played enough that the edge of the armrest lost a lot of its gold there, as well as the top of the tailpiece, which happens a lot when people's arms go over it. But this is one of a kind, and just an illustration of the Gibson Custom Shop stuff. Before, I wanted to show you this. During the Depression, there wasn't a lot of interest in banjo. Nobody was buying them and such. Gibson was making banjos for other people, like in this case, Montgomery Ward's. They essentially were using up old parts. But in doing so, they created for $46 a banjo that's every bit a Gibson Mastertone. And if you ask people like me, I would rather have this than a TB6. But I'll point out the fact of the matter is the fingerboard inlays are the same. They're in different order, but they're the same set of inlays, as are the peghead inlays. This one's a little bit fatter, but if you see a typical Gibson 6 inlay pattern, it's the same inlays that are on this. This one, like the TB6, has binding going up the side of the neck, as well as the side of the neck. The purfling is this sparkle purfling, which was normally used as one of the options on the Florentine banjo. And while it's not on a Granada, the resonator is essentially just like a Granada with this beautiful finish, same finish, and same shading and everything. So as I say, Gibson was using, it's the same tone ring and everything, a less elaborate engraving pattern, but still gold-plated, still engraved, and every bit a Gibson Mastertone, and in my opinion, better than a Mastertone, better than the TB6. And as I say, Montgomery Ward's could sell this for $46.
Wow.
And Gibson sold the TB6 for $140. So there was some profit to be made at $46. So,
Wow.
yeah. So pretty cool.
Yeah.
And varying on how it sounds. And I actually like the diamond pattern better. I have one of these in the chrome version, and it's just like one of my favorite banjos. I just like to look at it while I'm playing it.
Yeah.
Because I love this. I love this purfling,
Yeah.
and I can see it while I'm playing. And I look down and I see that beautiful, maple and everything. In addition to sounding really good as a tenor banjo, it's really it's very pleasant to look at and just embrace as you're making music with it. So
Gregory.
one thing that should differentiate a Recording King banjo or any banjo that Gibson made for someone else is they should not have a truss rod cover. This little cover here, you take it off and it allows you access to the truss rod, which allows you to correct for a bowing in the neck. That was a Gibson patent, and at the time, nobody else had it. And Gibson didn't want that included on a lesser grade banjo coming out of their factory. So they made these, and the truss rods are in them. but there's usually no truss rod cover. So if you see a truss rod cover on a recording king, typically what has happened is somebody over the years has opened that hole up so that they could get access to the truss rod. But most recording kings, if they're stock, this little wooden overlay, probably pear wood overlay, just goes all the way to the bottom. Truss rod is under there, and you can x-ray it, and it's all there, it's ready to go, but you have to cut the hole out to get access to it.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Another, sorry to interrupt, another quick thing I learned to see.
another Florentine from 1929. Now, this one, as we talked about the white holly finish, this is a perfect example to show this. In a period of time, because the flathead tone rings were bringing $35,000, people were pulling them out and selling them, and that's what happened to this banjo. This banjo was in the collection of Akira Samura in Japan. You probably have heard about that. Huber put one of his HR30 tone rings in here, and it was engraved exactly like a Florentine would be. So for the purposes of display, it doesn't look any different than it would otherwise, but minus the very, very expensive tone ring. What makes this one also kind of special is that there is a fingerboard extension on here. This is all original. Nothing was added to it, but the fact that these pictures, as we talked about being scenes of Venice, they were a very defined group of pictures. If you look at a Florentine, they're all the same pictures. Even a plectrum, they all have the same pictures on the fingerboard. And I just said, okay, I don't know anything about Venice, but what are these pictures on the rest of them? So they had to come up with something extra. So had to put a lot of thought into this. Also, if you notice, the celluloid on this is completely pure white or ivory, as opposed to this pearlish grain. You'll find a number of Gibsons Florentines over the years that had this ungrained celluloid in them. There's no particular pattern that we know of, but they show up. And then the most curious thing is this truss rod cover here with the name Al McBurney. Al McBurney is the real name of a guy named, who went on stage by Alvino Ray. You might know that name. He used to play with the King Sisters, and he'd play steel guitar and that sort of thing. But Alvino Ray was a quite prominent band leader in the 40s. Alvino Ray did have a Gibson Florentine. I don't think this was it. But I firmly believe that this is off of Al McBurney or Alvino Ray's Florentine. But this one, because of its checkered and long past, has been purported to be a number of things it's not. So I'm trying to, be as square as we can and be as historically accurate as we can by pointing out. I don't want people to come back after I'm dead and say, you said that it was Alvino Ray's banjos. Well, I don't think it is. But Alvino, the only picture I could find of Alvino Ray with a Florentine was on a pack of matches, promotional matches, and this fingerboard extension isn't there. So another oddity, more than anything, by Gibson, it's called a TBX. We've applied the term X meaning experimental. What was really happening was Gibson was trying to develop a banjo, a four-string banjo, to be the signature banjo for a banjoist named Harry Reeser. Harry was like the tenor banjo god. He was the benchmark that every other tenor banjoist was measured by. So he was an endorser for Gibson, and they were trying to come up with a model that would be named for him. And this was it. Now, that said, while there are references to the Reeser model in the Gibson ledgers, they never produced a Harry Reeser model. The examples of this banjo that are around are all called a TBX. Now, there's some very significant changes that happen here. I will point out for you. By the early 1930s, Gibson had replaced this tube and plate two-piece flange with what was now a one-piece cast flange. It is it's cast out of zinc, and it still has this little humpy protrusion that looks like a tube and a plate, but it's actually one piece. So by this point in time, we got to the point what we call the one-piece flange, very common Gibson collector term. At that point, that's where everything goes out the window on this banjo. Why is it different? Has an experimental tone ring. It looks like a flathead tone ring. All it is basically a sheet of brass that has holes drilled through it and is rounded off on the top. Very, very cheap to build, as was the one-piece flange. It was less expensive to produce than having to cast and machine down these 40-hole archtop rings. This one has this Art Deco influence kind of pie plate design on the back. Interesting enough, but just very, very unusual for a Gibson. The neck is very cool. This was aimed at tenor banjo players. This is the first, not the only, but it's the first to have a 20-fret neck, okay? Normally you only had 19 frets, and yet the problem was if you're a tenor banjo player, that means you can only go up to E. And because the key of F is so popular, banjo players wanted the neck to go up to F. So they added this 20th fret, which added a little scale to it. And maybe if it were a better tone ring system, it might be a little better sound. That we can't say. The other incredibly cool thing about this is the fingerboard, unlike any other Gibson prior to this, is radiused. I don't know if you can see that from the side there, but like their jazz guitars, they were allowing a radius to be more comfortable to fret the fingers. It follows more of a natural flow of your hand going around to have this curvature on the fingerboard. But the radius doesn't stop on the fingerboard. This is the only banjo, that's production banjo we've ever seen, where the binding itself is also radiused. You have to look carefully, but the binding usually goes right up to a square edge. On this particular banjo, the whole binding is radiused. So if you wrap your hands around it, it feels round. You don't have a hard edge like you have on any of these. Just do that. Put your hand around there. Yeah. You feel what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just very comfortable.
Yeah.
It would be, like I say, it's something I would like to see on other instruments, but then my question would be, do you start sliding your strings off the side of the fingerboard? Yeah. You know, that we don't know. I'll point out at this point in time, the peg head shape went to, from this fiddle shape that we had been introduced earlier, to what we call the double cut peg head. It's a different, completely different, little more modern. 75, or the updated version of the TB3, basically. Completely original and in almost perfect condition. You don't see them like this too often. This one, manufactured of walnut. The fingerboard, like you say, has this more modern, we call it the Flying Eagle pattern. Again, the double cut peg head. The cast flange, I specifically wanted to show you this because these flanges were cast of zinc, and the early ones that we encounter, they had a breakdown of the zinc. It was called zinc pest, and they started to, because of the pull of these hooks to maintain head tension, the flanges started to pull up, and if you look on the side of this very closely here, you can see how it's pulling up towards you. These are prone to breakage. You can see it's exaggerated, but it's pulled up that way. They're prone to breakage and such. So to find a one-piece flange intact in this good a condition is really great. This is also chrome plated, not nickel plated. Has a little bit of a bluish cast to it. And again, we bought this as part of a collection of banjos. And when I first saw it, my instinct told me, I said, well, it's a reproduction, because Gibson did reproduce this banjo back in the 80s, and they made them in tenor version. So I said, oh, that's a reproduction, you know, TB4. But then you look at it, and I opened it up, and it has all the pre-war markings and everything. Let me show you those if you're not familiar. First thing is the label, the Mastertone label that goes in here. They have been replicated so many times, and usually, well, first off, if you know what they look like, you can tell right off the bat if it's a fake. But some of these have been replicated quite well, but they miss little details like the eye in workmanship and will have to be perfectly lined up. And people that computer generate these things, the little thing that says workmanship, except for heads and strings, and the will underneath, those have to be perfectly lined up. It's right in here. So the guys have been very masterful trying to create them, or recreate them.
Ship and what?
And the word will below it, the I in those two words, in the line below it.
Oh, okay.
So they have to line up. And guys have done pretty good, but you know, if you know the banjos, you can look at it and say, that absolutely real. Then what we look at is a couple of things. Typically, they call them factory order numbers rather than serial numbers. I just use serial number for ease of remembering. They would chalk them in. It's kind of a greasy chalk, so it doesn't go away too easily. It's been there since the beginning. And the guy who did these had a very distinctive handwriting. And you can tell that there have been so many banjos that have tried to recreate by putting in the chalk, or mislead people by putting in the chalk. There's no question that's the hand of the guy who did it. And also, the factory order number would, when they made a batch of a certain style of banjos, they would paint the factory order number up here by the neck notch, and then whatever number in that lot, in this case, the fact 9466 was the batch of banjos. This was the 44th banjo in that. And so, you know, you're looking for stuff like that. And again, had I seen that, and whoever did this painting, it's almost always by the same hand, and you can always tell the same numbering and everything. So yeah, it's really, this is the stuff we look for, and had I seen it, I would never have thought it's a reproduction, but it was just a condition.
Don't they print, stamp?
What's that?
Don't they stamp some numbers in there somewhere?
Yeah, the serial or factory order, yeah, that's inside the rim here. And you will see that right there.
Same number?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes.
Okay.
946644.
And what's this? I don't think
That's
I've ever seen that.
That's the patent applied for stamp.
Okay.
It was, I don't know why they would carry that patent applied for stamp over so long, because the 2P or the flange configuration had long been awarded. So I don't know why it's still there, but there were, and you're going to see in a minute here, a lot of parts that hung around Gibson for a long time. The Florentine was Italian inspired. The Bella Voce, while it is named with an Italian name, it was Spanish inspired, or the decoration on the Bella Voce. It's all Spanish floral designs. Gibson really apparently didn't care to, or do their history too well, because, like I say, they took great liberties with these names. But there was a degree of, I guess, comment that why don't you have an American banjo? So in 1930, it said in the video 1932, it was 1930, they introduced the All-American model. All-American is very similar to the Florentine and Bella Voce. And when we say hand-carved, I'm going to make some qualification on that. But carved, painted, engraved, it's a really a tour de force is the only word to describe it as far as a patriotic themed banjo. Starting with this eagle, spread eagle on the back, these Americana and patriotic themes of olive branches and stuff all carved in the back. Of course, this eagle carved into the peghead shape with his talons perched here on the Gibson logo. It's a little more than I like to see on a banjo, but very, very significant in the fact that that they made a small number. Gibson introduced this in the beginning of the Great Depression. It was their most expensive banjo. It was $550. And the banjo was falling from favor at the time, so there were very, very few, All-Americans. Basically, if we go by the ledger, total of 26. So there aren't many that have been made. Gibson on the Florentine, the La Voce, and All-American will tell you this is hand carved. It's not. The back of the resonator on those three models is pressed. Okay. Now, the side of the resonator and the heel carving and this stuff, that was hand done. But these were done in batches by a production company in Grand Rapids that supplied the Gibson company with the backs of the resonator, and then they were painted, of course. But Gibson reintroduced the All-American back in early 1970s, and we have a couple of them here in the museum. Try to take a good look at this because of the coloring and the detail is still so much more refined than that 70s reproduction, which is, they're garish. They just look awful. I mean, they're pale by comparison to detail. The fingerboard, just like those scenes of Venice, this is very cool. It's got Columbus's ship and wagon trains going west, the Statue of Liberty, the Washington Monument, log cabin, I'm assuming Abraham Lincoln's home, the Capitol building, and tanks from World War I, tanks down there, and the Spirit of St. Louis. Wow. So these are all little scenes of Americana on there. The engraving on the side is meant to replicate fireworks going off in different directions. So it's a unique engraving pattern, which also carries through onto the armrest and All-American on the tailpiece there. So it's a real special banjo. We have had those reproductions in our collection all along, and I always wanted to get a pre-war one. And as I say, with so few of them available or having been made, Akira Samura contacted me last year, and this is one of the banjos this is the first All-American he acquired for his collection, and he held on to it when his collection was dispersed. So he offered it to us, and thankfully our board of directors went along with that purchase. So, and we got a couple other really special banjos from him as well. So that's a very cool one. This is something, just another curiosity. This I picked up on eBay from someone who had no idea what it was, and I looked and I saw immediately what it was. This was the carver's model for the peg head. So the guy who did the carving, this was in his shop, and you can see very faintly on here, Gibson All-American, and must have had a string where he had all his models or whatever hanging around. So that was a neat thing to get. So, one other thing here, also curiosity on these All-American models. This little shield up here, it's a very minute point, I guess, but the amount of stripes vary from All-American to All-American. Really? And the order in which they're red and white also vary from All-American to All-American, and the number of stars above vary from All-American to All-American. So there aren't a lot of examples to go by, but we've never seen two All-Americans with exactly the same spacing and amount of stripes and placement of stripes and amount of stars above. They're all a little bit different. And these little lines here, which we didn't even know until somebody pointed it out, are barbed wire. I don't know what that signifier, but yeah, but they're
Just the West ranching and
Yeah.
whatever, probably,
yeah. Talked about that ball bearing tone ring system earlier, trying to make it easier for the musicians who had to deal with these heads that were fluctuating with temperature and humidity. Drum makers who had skin heads on drums from the beginning had already solved the problem by allowing hardware on the top of a snare drum or a drum to allow you to adjust the head tension from the top. Banjo makers didn't get it. Now, none of them, but there were drum companies that were making banjo. There was Leedy, there was Slingerland, there was Ludwig, and because, thank you, they were all drum makers. Their banjos had what we call top tension hardware. Now Gibson, in a classic display of being behind the curve and not showing the best business sense, in 1936 redesigned the Mastertone banjo. The banjo had fallen from favor. The guitar had all but replaced the four-string banjo. There were very few people playing banjo in country music, and if they were, they weren't buying $500 banjos for the most part. But Gibson saw the lessons that they had learned from everything they did prior to this all came to fruition, and they redesigned the Mastertone banjo in 1936. And this is the result. We call them the top tension Gibson Mastertones. It's the first and only pre-war Gibson Mastertone banjo that had the flathead tone ring as standard equipment, okay? It has this hardware that now allows you to adjust the head tension from the top. They had corrected the problem with the zinc pest, so no longer were the flanges flaring out. As a tenor banjo, this is the only production banjo I told you about that has 20 frets on it, like that TBX. They learned from the TBX. It has the radiused fingerboard, like the TBX, only production banjo pre-war that had that in it, and has a very, very distinctive Art Deco influence. Again, look at the new peg head shape, and the inlay shape, very influenced by Art Deco architecture. The resonator on this banjo, in addition to this beautiful coloration and the bird's eye maple figuring, the back of this, unlike other Gibson Mastertone banjos which were laminated, this is a solid wood. Now it's two pieces of wood that were book matched together, about almost an inch thick, which were turned down on a lathe to give you this bump out here, but it's almost flat around the edges. Then you get this bump out that looks more like a typical banjo. Inside of the resonator, it's perfectly flat. And from the highest point of the bump to the inside, almost 3/4 of an inch. And it's very solid. So if you remember a little earlier in the talk, we talked about adding mass to a banjo. Yeah. This is the most massive banjo we know of. And it's, weighs in somewhere around 15 pounds. It's pretty hefty. And because of all that mass, and I play one of these as one of my primary banjos, I can tell you, it has that headroom that we're looking for. You can play it harder, you can get more volume, you get more sustain. As far as I'm concerned, this is the best banjo design that Gibson ever made. Yeah. But because they brought them out at the time that so few people were buying banjos or playing banjos, there aren't a lot of them. This particular one is, like that Florentine back there, one of the most pristine examples in existence. I can't say it's as pristine because there is that little hint of wear here, but that's the only hint at all that this banjo was ever played. Frets are in perfect condition. It's a really, really great example of the TB-18. Now they made a lesser expensive one, the TB-12, which was mahogany, and it was chrome plated, it wasn't engraved, has a completely different sound. So you asked about, the wood. in that case, that's one banjo I can say, yes, the difference between maple and all this mass of maple and mahogany is noticeable. It really is. And then they made a very simple one called the TB7, which was maple yet, but it was just dark stained maple, very, very plain. But this to me, everything that Gibson learned about banjos and how to make them sound good and feel good and play good all came to bear on this. This is a great banjo. This is a prime example of Gibson making money for themselves. This is listed in their ledgers as an All-American. If you ever see the Gibson ledgers on the internet, sometime little pages will show up. Whatever the neck of any banjo that they made is, that's how it shows up on the ledger. So this neck is a Gibson All-American neck. And if you look at the ledger, it says Gibson All-American. Or it says All-American Special. What makes it special is the fact that it was put together in 1940. Even though the factory order number or serial number inside is a 1930 date, there were parts hanging around the factory, and they would do their best to fill an order when an order came in. So an order was made for an All-American, but there were simply no All-American parts other than a neck hanging around the factory. So they took this neck, and then if you've heard the term floor sweep banjo, this is the floor sweep of all floor sweep banjos. Floor sweep Gibson banjos typically have a part or two that doesn't conform to the catalog description. Outside of the neck, and even back to the pearls, these aren't even the right tuners. These should be engraved two-band tuners, and these should be mother of pearl buttons on them. I mean, these are the things that are mentioned in the catalog description. So the tuners aren't right, but the neck is right, and the binding and purfling, the black purfling are right, and everything else about this is all American. The neck, from my hand up here, this is an All-American, and that's where the similarity ends. The tension hoop is a grooved tension hoop from an earlier Style 5 banjo, probably from 1925 or 26. It has the flat hooks, which long had been replaced by the rounded hooks and the notch tension hoop. So this is a Style 5 tension hoop. The tone ring is from a Bella Voce. It is the Bella Voce engraving pattern. Okay. The armrest is a Granada engraving pattern. The flange, which is a one-piece flange, by the way, it's got its zinc pest pulling up here, is engraved like a Florentine. The resonator is from a Florentine. The purfling is, we call it Christmas tree binding or purfling, and it doesn't match what should be on the neck. This is a hodgepodge of parts, but all completely original. It was sent out to Belson's Music in Minneapolis, and whoever ordered it sent it right back because it's not an All-American. Then Gibson sent it out on speculation to a music store in Dayton, Ohio. They sent it back after about a year. Then they sent it on speculation to a place called Pop's Music, and there's a little label inside. And Pop's Music kept it only because the owner, Ed Pop, used it as his playing banjo until he died in 1950. And then it stayed in his family until about 2009 or 10. And it was bought by Buddy Walker. Buddy bought it. And then it stayed in Buddy's hands for a while. And then this banjo and this banjo and two more, but they're not in here, by different manufacturers, were bought on behalf of the museum by a benefactor named Glenn Peisker, who donated them to the museum. And Now, here we go. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have 5 stars here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stars on this one. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stripes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stripes on that one. So again, it's just one of these little mysteries, and I'd really wonder if I'm sure whoever did it was doing it to create some sort of mystery about it. But I wonder if there's any rhyme or reason or pattern why he or she did it. I had Greg Rich build me a banjo, and I said, build something that 100 years from now someone's going to take it apart and say, what's all this about, you know, and raise some eyebrows. Because we were talking about stuff just like this. I said, just do something that will, you know, make them scratch their heads 100 years from now. He went a little overboard. But, yeah. So, I've only got a couple other things here to show you. I wanted to just touch base on another banjo that Gibson made for a different manufacturer. This is called a Trujo banjo. There was a performing couple named in California named Truett and George, and Trujo became a contraction of their names. And Gibson manufactured these banjos for them. They were radio artists, and the prevailing thought was that banjos, 4-string banjos, were very trebly sounding on the radio, so they were trying to do anything they could to accentuate the bass spectrum of the banjo. So they created this very deep body and this really, really insane tone ring system. But the reality is that they do sound kind of lower in the bass spectrum and more mellow. And what they did worked. Now this flange looks more like a bacon thing than a Gibson pattern, but these were definitely all made by Gibson. They've got this, again, little hoop or tube around here supporting the hooks for the head tensioning. They said it's a lion. I think it's a gargoyle, but it's a really grotesque carving on the top of the peg head. But interesting enough banjo, and again the fact that Gibson would do just about anything for anyone. We have some other Trujo banjos out there, and one of them, the style B or C. Oh yeah, okay. Okay. You'll notice it has the Hearts and Flowers peg head or fingerboard inlay on it. I mean it's not obviously tuned up, but it's a Presto tailpiece, and we have to guess that Presto or Grover must have made this hardware for them as well, because it's a contiguous accessory to the tailpiece. Gibson introduced their first line of electric instruments in 1936. This one is actually from a year later, but in 1936, even though the banjo was, like I say, falling from favor and going out of style, they thought enough of the banjo marketplace to create, in addition to an electric guitar, the ES-150, the Charlie Christian guitar that we all talk about, they applied that same technology with this Charlie Christian type pickup to this electric banjo, and they took a banjo shell essentially, and again using up some parts, and put in this big inside of here. You can't see it, but it's a really massive pickup assembly that went into it. It has a similar, this is not a mute, but it's a vibrato, like a whammy bar on a modern guitar. And you plug it in, and tone and volume control. But I'll call attention to the similarity of the neck to the top tension here. It's the same peg head shape. This has the bow tie inlays that you had mentioned. This is a neck or a fingerboard that you would typically have seen on a TB7 or TB7. But this is finished in a sunburst finish on the back. So the TB7 is just a brown maple finish. So again, nice attention to detail and experiment. They don't sound too good, you know, they're okay, but not great.
All those screws on the back, or for what?
Just to hold the back on, because you take these off and then you can get at the
you
electronic
get
guts.
the
Yep, yep.
Of all of the major manufacturers which played a role in the development and ultimate perfection of the banjo in the United States, the name Gibson is the one which remains most recognized. While Gibson is also well known for their other fretted instruments, the banjo innovations and designs to come out of the factory at 225 Parson Street in Kalamazoo, Michigan during the 1920s and 30s continue to defy comparison and define the highest quality in the banjo making art. A musician himself, the company's namesake, Orville H. Gibson, was born in 1856 and began making handmade guitars and mandolins in the late 1890s. Unlike the mandolins of European design, distinguished by their large rounded body, Orville's instruments were much thinner, constructed with a carved solid wood top and bent wood back and sides. While unknown at the time, his innovative design would prove to be the basis for virtually all mandolins which were to follow. In the early 1900s, the mandolin was the most popular stringed instrument in America, and Orville Gibson's instruments were being met with great acceptance. Made to believe that he had taken his individual effort as far as he could go on his own, in 1902, a group of Kalamazoo businessmen convinced Orville to sell both his patents and his vision for the princely sum of $2,500, and the Gibson Mandolin and Guitar Manufacturing Company Limited was established. Orville Gibson never owned the company which bears his name. Although the company offered other fretted instruments, in the first 20 years of existence, the Gibson Company began a long pattern of focusing its research and production effort on the most popular instrument of the day, in this case the mandolin. The refinement of Orville's original designs into the perfect mandolin was an ongoing effort which seemed blissfully unaware of the banjo boom on the horizon. Gibson's earliest entries in the banjo market were elegant in appearance, but reflected more the company's favor to the established mandolin market than an innovative design thrust into the upcoming musical trend represented by the banjo. By the early 1920s, Gibson's lack of foresight in the banjo market found them playing a frantic game of catch-up and fighting for their very existence. In 1920, Gibson hired legendary mandolinist and acoustic engineer Lloyd Loar, who was put in charge of research and development. While Loar obviously favored the mandolin and its continued development, he can also claim a share of banjo fame as the engineer who designed the first of a long and ever-evolving line of Gibson Mastertone banjos. Loar innovations include Gibson's floating ball-bearing tone ring, as well as the banjo industry's first true full resonator, both seen on Loar's personal Gibson TB5 Mastertone banjo. While these design improvements reflect Gibson's innovative mastery, their best banjo efforts were yet to come. Following Loar's departure in January 1924, a new corporation aimed at reviving the failing company was formed. Renamed Gibson Incorporated, the new management's first responsibility was to make Gibson competitive in the banjo marketplace. Borrowing the general look of the full resonator banjos which Paramount introduced 2 years earlier, Gibson engineers incorporated their own innovations, such as Lloyd Loar's ball-bearing tone ring and the industry's only adjustable neck truss rod, into a new, completely redesigned line of Gibson Mastertone banjos which debuted in 1925. As with mandolin development 2 decades earlier, Gibson was tenacious in its efforts to perfect the most popular instrument of the day, putting the bulk of their research, development, and production efforts into the banjo. The result of this endeavor was a quickly evolving series of banjo design advancements which would represent the finest banjos that Gibson would ever produce. In 1927, Gibson introduced what many consider to be their ultimate banjo designs. For sound and playability, these banjos sported Gibson's new 40-hole archtop tone ring, as well as a very slim and comfortable neck made possible by Gibson's now patented neck truss rod. To accommodate almost any budget, like most other banjo manufacturers, Gibson offered a variety of levels of decoration on their banjos, all built around the standard array of Mastertone components. Mastertone banjos in 1927 went from the basic TB3 all the way up to the elegance of the hand-carved and painted Florentine and Bella Voce. To establish and sell their new designs, Gibson embarked on a masterful and very expensive marketing campaign that would be the envy of any modern-day advertiser. In addition to endorsements from prominent musicians being secured, the company published a purely promotional magazine entitled Mastertone, which was widely distributed to music retailers. And to read the text of the 1927 Gibson catalog, one could not help but feel themselves anything less than a complete social outcast or professional failure if he or she were to be playing anything less than a Gibson banjo. The company's dominance in the banjo marketplace, as well as their ongoing banjo development, continued into the 1930s, even as the banjo was falling from favor. Following the introduction of their ultimate banjo offering, the stately All-American in 1932, Gibson introduced yet another series of completely redesigned Mastertone banjos in 1936. To maintain full production during the years of the Great Depression, in addition to instruments which bore the Gibson name, the company often manufactured banjos for other distributors. Two notable examples of these are the Recording King banjos made from Montgomery Ward, as well as the Trujo banjos, distinctive for their lion-shaped peghead, which were marketed by a popular West Coast musical duo known as Truett and George. In 1937, when Gibson production was making a dramatic shift away from the banjo to accommodate the new demand for guitars, the company demonstrated further belief in the dying banjo market by including an unusual electric tenor banjo in their first offering of electric guitars. Since their first introduction in 1918, Gibson banjos have been a standard of comparison for both musicians and manufacturers alike. Of all of the companies which produced banjos during the golden age of the 1920s and 30s, Gibson remains the only one in business today. Even at times when banjo popularity was not at its peak, Gibson consistently offered a line of quality banjos to the public. When the nostalgic craze of the late 1940s hit, followed by the folk and bluegrass music boom of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Gibson stood ready to provide the needed instruments with both designs which had been proven decades earlier, as well as new innovations to the banjo marketplace. For what has become a synonym for banjo quality, the Gibson Mastertone.